Welcome, everybody, to the Interventional Endoscopist podcast. I'm your host, Mankanwal Sachdev, and today I'm going to be talking about endoscopic ultrasound once again in the ambulatory surgical center, specifically using Endosound. And today I have the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Stuart Akerman, who is a physician colleague of mine. He's out in Texas, and he works for GI Alliance. And Stuart, how are you doing? Welcome.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, no, this is going to be a fun thing. So this is actually going to be the first of a two-part podcast. The first part today, we're going to be focusing on Endosound and ASC, EUS, a lot of acronyms there. And then we're also going to do the second part, which will be talking about artificial intelligence in the clinical practice for not only general GI, but interventional endoscopy and how it makes all of our lives easier and what the pitfalls are and what the advantages are, et cetera. But we're going to start with the ultrasound, which I think Stuart, you know, is a passion of mine and yours as well. I first learned about you through, well, number one, you reached out to me and about your passion for EUS and ASC. And the second thing was in working with Endosound a little bit, I came to know about you because they were talking about how many cases you've done and how your experience has been really good. So I thought this is just a real great way for us to kind of talk about this and get this information out to our colleagues in interventional endoscopy.
Yeah, I would, sort of starting out, if someone's interested in EUS, which I think most of, the listeners are, this is something everyone should really be thinking about. It's a way to transform your practice and to make your life easier, better patient care, better work-life balance, the whole 9 yards. And, Endosound to that has been a little bit of a means to an end for me. It's been a great partnership. I will mention for your listeners that I'm currently a physician advisor for Endosound, but I actually didn't start out that way. I just started out as an interventional gastroenterologist who was really interested in bringing EUS into the ASC and brought Endosound and was so impressed with the platform, even in its infancy stages, that I wanted to be a part of making it even better. And they were thankfully willing to collaborate.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the meat of the matter, let's talk a little bit about you. So, kind of tell us about your biography. Where did you go to medical school, residency, fellowship, all those types of things?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York, born and raised in Brooklyn, spent most of my formative years pretty much within 25 miles of my house, went to school locally, actually graduated college and went into finance at Merrill Lynch. Realized it wasn't for me and went back to school so that I could become a physician. And I was one of the first, I think, one of the first classes for the Columbia Post-Baccalaureate program. And then, nowadays, thankfully, it's proliferated. It's all over the country. But I went after that to New Jersey Medical School, which is now Rutgers Medical School. Fantastic experience. And then for residency and fellowship, again, stayed fairly local. Went to Montefiore Medical Center, which is part of Albert Einstein, for my residency. And then for fellowship, I had the privilege of going to North Shore LIJ in Long Island and really had just fantastic training and an experience out there. I stayed on as an academic physician for a couple years, worked with them, was part of the inaugural class at Hofstra University Medical Center, at Hofstra University for their medical school. And after a couple years, I moved out to Plano, which is about 5 minutes north of Dallas, joined Digestive Health Associates of Texas, and I've been there since 2015. So again, 9 years now, and it's been a blessing. I absolutely love being out here. I love working with all my colleagues. My patients are the best. It's been pretty great.
So what brought a New Yorker to there's no, I won't call it the dirty South, but we'll call it the South, Texas. The dirty South to the east side of that. So
yeah, so it's an interesting conversation. I always had it in my head that I wanted to leave New York. New York is great; it's a lot of fun for anyone who's ever been there. But I wanted somewhere a little bit slower paced to raise my kids. And, when I was younger, it really wasn't much of an issue. But once I got married, once I had my first daughter, I realized I needed to be somewhere that had a little less of a grind, a place that I could grow professionally, but at the same time, be able to have the time earmarked so that I could go to dance recitals and I can, hang out at soccer games and all the like. And, after a couple of years, I sat down with my wife and I said, I think it's time. I think we really got to consider moving somewhere. But for me, I really didn't want to shovel snow anymore. I mean, that was my one thing. So I said, pretty much Mason-Dixon line or south is where we should be considering moving. And we looked in several places. I interviewed with several practices throughout the South. And for me, it was really important for me to join a practice, not only that would allow me to grow, but that would be the right fit, because I spend, much like you, right? We spend the majority of our lives hanging out with this group of people. And I wanted to make sure that I felt comfortable, number one. Mm-hmm. And then number two, I was a very young interventional endoscopist. And I knew that as much as I knew, there was way more that I didn't.
Right.
And I wanted to be in a situation where I was with someone who had a comfort level and an interest in mentoring a younger physician. And I didn't have that my first couple of years. I was in an academic practice, and yet I was somehow on my own. And that, it's a different discussion for another time. It certainly helped me grow, but the way it helped me grow was more like feet to the fire. And I really wanted to try, since I was going to be not starting over, but starting a new chapter, I really wanted to be in more of a situation where I could work with somebody who would function as like I said, a mentor, right, and really be there, not just to back me up, but to be invested in me becoming a better interventionalist. And that's really what happened here. I joined a practice with 6 other physicians, one of which is, I still feel, probably one of the 20 best interventional endoscopists in the country. And I had a very frank discussion with him when he interviewed me. Yeah. I said, how long are you going to stick around before you consider retiring? And are you interested in me being here so that you can help me become a better doctor? Or is it because you need someone to help you with call coverage? And he said, kind of both. And, I like that honest answer. And he couldn't have lived up to it any better than he did. I mean, my growth the first few years when I joined the practice was exponential.
Give him a shout out. Who is it?
His name is Mickey Goldschmidt.
Okay.
And he's currently he retired from our practice about 5 years ago now. And he joined the academic faculty at UT Southwestern. And like I said, to this day, I still think he's in the top 1% of all interventionalists in the country. He's amazing.
Yeah, no, I had a similar thing. I mean, I actually wasn't looking for a mentor. I wasn't actually that deliberate about it because I didn't have the experience before, mm-hmm. But I was lucky that the practice I joined had Ananya Das in it, and he's been a mentor to me since day one. We've gone from being, mentor-mentee to partners where we now sometimes butt heads and things like that. But, we are, and we're very good friends, and he's mentored me significantly. So I think, it's a key point that I've mentioned in other podcasts, but if you're a young physician listening to this and you're really looking for a job as an interventionalist, you really want to look for a practice where there is somebody who's willing to share with you and to mentor you. And, there's advantages for everybody in those situations, but it's very challenging as a young guy or girl to come out and be the one to start a program. I've seen that happen in locally here in Arizona, where I knew a physician who came out and they wanted to start their own practice as a month after finishing their interventional year, and it was not the greatest experience for them. So you need to have someone to guide you. So I think that's key. So what you said you started a career in finance. You didn't enjoy it as much, and so you ended up going to medical school. So in medical school, what pointed you towards internal medicine, and then during residency, what pointed you to GI? What are some of the things that influence your decision, and who are some of the mentors that kind of helped you decide that?
Yeah, so great question. I didn't know right away. I mean, I had a great situation. Everything that I checked out, I loved. And I think that's kind of the right mindset when you're in medical school is don't close doors, just walk into each one of them. And, even in third year, when I started doing rotations, every one of them I'd walk into and be like, yeah, I can see myself doing this. This is great. And, you know, as it started turning to fourth year, my advisor was getting a little nervous because I wasn't honing in on anything in particular. But, you know, I always had an idea that I liked the idea of the balance. I liked the idea of being able to think through problems, you know, not sort of making everyone into this algorithm, but also the idea that I could actually do something with my hands and fix an issue. You know, that sort of definitive feedback that you can get, like you do when you do a procedure. So I started leaning a little bit more towards surgery in that sense, but I wasn't sure that I had the right mindset for surgery. And, you know, that's where I had to start really kind of sitting down and thinking about it. And then, you know, sort of as an example of how, what's that saying? Man plans, God laughs. Mm-hmm. I had an away rotation at Cornell.
Okay.
And I was supposed to do anesthesia for the rotation. And they called me and said, it's overbooked. We made a mistake. We can't put you in there, but how about we just put you in gastroenterology? And I mean, I just, you know, like improv, it's all yes and. I said, sure, let's try gastroenterology. Let's see what happens. And that's where I got lucky enough to be put on a team where the attending was Mark Pachapin. And Mark Pachapin currently is the chief at NYU, heavily involved in every major national GI society, and an amazing man. And he really, him and, you know, his fellows on the team, they really just made me realize this is the right fit for me. I mean, it really just an amazing month, amazing experience. Got to see how, you know, they sometimes deal with the sickest people that there are, the sickest patients, but always with a smile, always enjoying what they do, showing up, kind of, you know, happy every single day to work. And that really made an impression on my young fourth year medical student mind. And that's really, after I went back to school, I was like, this is great. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, after that, applied to internal medicine. You know, GI was very competitive. I mean, there were a lot of people in my practice, in my internship, who were interested in GI. I don't remember the exact number, but I want to say it was certainly over 10. It might have been closer to about 20 people.
Yeah.
Applied for GI my year, which is a lot. It's a big program, but you know, that's still, you know, 25% or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was super competitive, but you know, I got lucky. I got a spot in the end, and you know, I'm forever thankful. Maurice Cerulli is the program director. I still keep in touch with him to this day. He's always been there to sort of push me, not let me become complacent. Even to this day, I'll ask him about something or other, and he'll sort of challenge me. And I mean, absolutely amazing individual who I you know, there's a lot of people along the way I could say I owe everything to, and certainly, you know, Mickey Goldschmidt being one of them. But Maurice really gave me my shot. I mean, he's the guy who saw me and said that he saw something, and he gave me an opportunity and gave me that spot. And I'll forever be grateful.
Yeah, I know his name because, you know, I don't know if you heard in the past, but it took me a few years to get into GI, just kind of circumstances I'm applying. And I think I know every program director in the country, because back in the day, I think I applied to every single program that existed. So when people mention their program directors, like, oh yeah, I applied there. Yeah, I applied there. Yeah. So I know those names, but I never had the pleasure of meeting them. So you graduate GI, you know, obviously you had some goals when you graduated, and now you know, when you moved to Texas, your goals changed. What changed in your goals and for your future, for your career, kind of what's evolved since you were in Hofstra, correct? You said when you were teaching?
Yeah. So, I was I forget now, I was an assistant, associate, whatever the lowest level is.
Yeah. Assistant. I know that because that's when I am. So.
But, you know, I absolutely loved it. You know, it was I took a little time to make a lecture, but I actually loved it because medical students have no filter. And, you know, if you don't know what you're talking about, they're going to find out quick.
Yeah.
And it was a great challenge that I thoroughly enjoyed. It really taught me from early on that teaching is a component that I hadn't considered that I really need to keep with my practice. You know, when I graduated, my real focus was strictly just I need to see patients. I need to help as many people as possible, sort of boots on the ground type mentality. You know, one of my biggest regrets to this day actually is that I didn't get my MBA, because one of my deans, many times throughout my first couple of years of med school said, hey, you really should take a year and get an MBA. You should, you know, you don't need 2 years. You only need 1 year if you're in a combined program. Rutgers has a great MBA program. If you want it, you're in. Like, it's not even an issue. And I kept saying to him, I appreciate it, but that's not what I want to do. Like, I don't want to be, you know, in a boardroom. I want to be seeing patients. Like, I'm never going to need an MBA. And that's got to be, I don't have many regrets, thankfully, because I operate under the guise of everything that happened got me to where I am today.
Right.
But that, I will say, if someone asks me what my regrets are, that's my regret. I wish I would have gotten my MBA, because I didn't realize how much I definitely would have used it. But to that, you know, I'm still very focused on clinical medicine. I mean, I love seeing patients and being able to help people. And it's rewarding from a personal / professional stance when someone says, you know, thank you so much. You know, I was having severe abdominal pain. You figured it out. You know, I feel so much better. You know, or anything along those lines. I think every physician feels that way. But part of my evolution as a physician and just maturing is that I realized that there's other ways to enhance the patient experience than just being their doctor.
Right.
And, you know, that involves so many different things for so many different people, right? Being involved in local policy, improving the sort of global dynamics in the delivery of care, being part of national discussions at how we deliver that care, and, you know, the methods in which we do it, the tools that we have to be able to improve those relationships. Those are all things that are really, really important for physicians to be involved in. And that's really why I made the decision that I need to spend a piece of my time being more involved in sort of the medical device and medical technology side of the practice, right, as well as the business side, because, you know, frankly speaking, being more cost efficient, you know, finding new pathways, they all impact your patient care at the end of the day, right? If
Absolutely.
your practice is floundering, you can't focus on being the best physician you need to be.
Right. Exactly. So speaking of that, let's talk about your current practice situation. And, you know, so you joined DHAT about 10 years ago.
Yeah, about 9 years ago, 2015.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit like what, you know, describe your practice for the listeners and kind of what your setup is and things like that.
Sure. So joined the practice in 2015. Initially, I worked as mostly a hospitalist. So first year, kind of lived in the hospital. Second year, started transitioning, getting more time in the office. And with the idea, which did happen, that when I hit the third year, I would transition to a more outpatient-based practice. Initially, when I started, very heavily interventional-based. And then over time, my practice evolved and more of like a 50-50 and even maybe a little more 60-40. At this point, I have a large general GI practice as well as a good chunk of an interventional-based practice. Some of that was because our practice was a fully private practice model up until about 2020. 2020, we, you know, merged with a larger private equity-backed practice. So that kind of changed the alignment of my practice a little bit. And then, you know, I also realized as I got older and I matured in the way I approached my practice, a big clinical interest I have is cancer, but specifically cancer prevention. And I think whether any gastroenterologist realizes it or not, and I think most do, we all have a clinical interest in cancer screening and prevention, right? The biggest thing we do is colonoscopy for polyp detection and removal, right? But the first couple years, I don't want to say I got depressed, but it really dawned on me very quickly that I'm seeing all these patients, I'm diagnosing these pancreatic cancers, these biliary cancers, and then what? Like, what am I doing to help these patients, right? Because they're coming in, they're stage 3, stage 4. The numbers, unfortunately, weren't great at the time. And I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point I realized, well, no, number one, I'm getting them a diagnosis. And as my confidence grew in my abilities, I realized not only am I getting a diagnosis for these people so that they can get the right treatment, but I'm getting it more quickly and more efficiently than they can get in a lot of places around where I'm practicing. So I'm offering this value that I can afford to these patients that they may not necessarily get somewhere else. And then I started to take that sort of one step further. I really kind of did a deep dive on how do I find these patients before they come to me, right? How do we find the right patients to screen so that we can find the cancers or the precancers and address them before they ever end up at my doorstep because they're symptomatic? Because that's the whole idea of what we're doing with colon cancer screening and breast cancer screening, right? We have enough of a tool base that we can afford to screen these people and find them before it's problematic. So, not to say we don't miss some every once in a while, but we're going to catch them at stage 1 and stage 2 rather than showing up in stage 3 and stage 4 when there's less that we can do for them.
Right.
And that really became a big focus of my practice. And, once I did that, it started to shift because now I'm starting to see some younger patients. Now I'm starting to see some patients who aren't as sick. And I have to make sure that I have the time available so that I can screen that high-risk pancreatic cancer patient with endoscopic ultrasound in an efficient manner.
Right.
And, those patients need that, and they continue to need that because we're keeping them healthy, which means we have to keep following them and keep making sure they do great.
No, absolutely. And I think, obviously when you start in a private practice, the way you grow your practice is to be the GI hospitals for the group a lot of times. And as you mentioned, you're getting the patients there that are already jaundiced or they're already lost 50 pounds and the family's like, oh, something's not right. And they're coming in and by that point they're metastatic or whatnot. But where you have the chance to affect changes when you're seeing them in the office and, you notice somebody's got a family history of pancreatic cancer and they're a little diabetic and now this is your time to screen them. So yeah. And so your practice has ASC or, when you joined them, there was an ASC component. There still is, but now it's part of the GI Alliance situation. And so you started looking at EUS, obviously, as a way to bring those patients easier care. So kind of talk about your algorithm, your decision tree to get your partners to agree to bringing EUS in the ASC. Because before you get into that, one thing I'll put a little footnote is for, in one of the first podcasts I did, I talked about this, but for the younger physicians listening out there thinking about joining private practices, there's not as many traditional private practices as there used to be, number one. Many of the groups, my own, Stuart's, are backed by private equity or big healthcare systems now. But one of the things that happens to a young physician is when you join a practice, you are trying to become a partner at some point, and you want to be a partner of the practice and you want to be a part of the ASC. And one of the distinct disadvantages that most interventionalists have in the ASC business model is that while it's not legal, nobody will ever tell you to your face that you can't be a partner in the ASC unless you hit certain volume metrics. They'll tell you that you have to have equal productivity, which is a buzzword for volume or a code word for volume. And the problem is when you're the guy going to the hospital your first year doing everyone's difficult ERCPs and EUSs and, all those sick patients, you're doing less in the ASC. So that can affect your ability to become a partner. Now, not all practices do that. There's some that are very fair about it and they look at, all right, you're an interventional guy and you're going to end up, spending 25% less time in the ASC, so we'll give you a discount. But there can be a downward effect of that where you're maybe not a partner right on time, or maybe you're half a partner or something like that. And so the more you can do in the ASC as an interventionalist, the better it is for you from a business perspective. And again, we know, and I'm not trying to minimize the effect of taking good care of patients and quality care of patients. I'm just talking from a business perspective purely that, it behooves you as an interventionalist to want to do EUS and the ASC because or even ERCP at some point, or EMRs or things like that, because Now you spend less time in the hospital and you're contributing to the pool for your partners, which then makes you, get better partnership opportunities. So that shouldn't be the driving thing, but it is something to understand and know before you join a private practice, that if you have that ability to grow in the ASC, not just for screening colonoscopies and GERD patients, but also for EUS guided liver biopsy or, gallbladder cancer screening or gallbladder polyp detection or things like that, you can add more to your pool. So I'll pause there. I said a lot, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there for the younger physicians who are listening in.
Yeah, so, I couldn't have said that better myself. And I only just want to emphasize how important that distinction is, because I don't think, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, I know, but I don't think that's taught to anybody, right? When they're in training, that's just a little bit of a black hole in their knowledge, and it's so important. I am lucky that I am in a practice that respects that and accommodates for that. But you're right, not everyone does.
No, and that's a problem too, is like, it's a problem with medical education in general, not just with GI fellowships, but when you are in a fellowship program, I can distinctly remember the vibe, the underlying vibe that, if you went to private practice, it's evil. Yeah, it's the dark side. You're joining, Emperor Palpatine, whatever. You are doing something wrong. Now, not all of my attendings believe that, but the vibe in all, not all, but the vibe in a lot of academic programs is that, private practice is bad. And I still remember interviewing for Interventional Endoscopy Fellowship with a very prominent interventionalist who was fantastic. He was the nicest guy in the world. But one thing he did request during the interview was that all my fellows who graduate from my program need to do 3 years of academic practice. He goes, I don't care if you go to private practice after that, but you got to give academics a try. And so there's this kind of discouragement, in the system of doing private practice. And you don't learn about any of it. You don't learn about an RVU. You don't learn about how to bill. You don't learn what business models look like. You don't learn about, and ASGE is doing some things now to help improve that with their fellows courses. But there's a big gap in knowledge for all of us when we're training about what the private world is. And, my partners were all in academic practice for years, and they had to learn everything on their own. They didn't have any mentorship. And so the practice we built was just by asking people questions and learning, so anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. So let's talk about your practice supporting the EUS. How did you make the case to them? Like, we need to do this. I want to do this. How are you going to support it?
Right. So just a little bit of background on my setup. So when, sort of pre-buyout or pre-merger, we had 5 ASCs underneath our initial DHAT practice. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit of an interesting financial setup, because ultimately I was invested in one as the dominant investment, but I had small pieces in the other 4. It was made a little more straightforward and specifically into one ASC. Because 3 years ago, or rather 4 years ago, when we merged with GIA, that was only for the clinical side of the practice. Mm-hmm. So we have a separate PE partner for our ASCs, which is AmSurg, and this was kept separate from the deal. So actually, for my office, if you want to think of it that way, I'm involved with GIA, and then for my ASC, I'm involved with AmSurg. And we've worked really, really hard, but we've driven a lot of efficiencies in our ASC, and we're thankfully, we're busy enough that we actually opened a second ASC about 15 minutes away, about 3 years ago. So, currently I'm at 2 different ASCs, all under kind of one umbrella. Right. And basically, where it kind of started for me with Endosound, right? And how I was able to get in the ASC. I just saw a random blurb on one of the wire sites about Endosound getting an FDA approval for EUS. And for years I've been thinking, and I know you have EUS and you have more of I would say a traditional setup in your ASC. And for years I've been thinking about, how do I make this happen? And it's a more challenging prospect, because at my main site, I'm the only person who does EUS. So whatever volume that needs to happen to make this make sense financially, all has to happen by one person. And that's more of a daunting task than if you have 2, 3, or 4 people that are, contributing to that recoupment. So I've always had, a little bit of a difficulty making the numbers make sense.
Right.
So I reached out to them and I told them I was completely interested, but I was very transparent that before I would consider any kind of relationship, I wanted to see what the imaging looked like. Right. So not just a picture on a website, but I wanted them to come by, bring me their product, and I was going to actually use it for some patients. And if it wasn't kind of up to snuff, I wasn't going to proceed.
Right.
And Josh Cohn, who you've met, who's the chief operating officer, came down himself the first day for my initial day of doing exams.
Yeah.
And you also have to remember, I'm at this point, we're talking January 2024. So I'm using the technology very much in its infancy, like Gen 1 kind of rough cut. And, for anyone who's not totally aware, Endosound is a novel way of approaching endoscopic ultrasound. So, most people who are listening or watching are doing EUS in the traditional way, where they have the large the large ultrasound array, whether it be like an Alpha 75 or an Arietta or one of these systems, and dedicated echo endosound scopes, right? So either a radial or a linear scope. So that means that you have a separate ultrasound array and separate distinct scopes that you have to use to do EUS.
Exactly.
Where Endosound is trying to break that paradigm is they're saying you don't necessarily need to refit everything in order to do EUS. Instead, we'll give you an over-the-scope probe that you can fasten to your scope, and now use your existing hardware, agnostic of who your vendor is. It doesn't matter. And now you can perform EUS, and their ultrasound is essentially the size of a Mac Mini. It's just a completely 5% of the size of the ultrasound array. And I have it set up with a tower. So they actually gave me where they put it on a tower. So it's just easier for me to sort of roll around depending on what room I'm in.
Right.
But technically speaking, I literally could just sit it right on top of my scope processor and actually just have it sitting in my regular cart if I was going to dedicate it in one specific room. So that's kind of the background. And for my initial exams, I had my scope, I had the transducer, which they call a UTM, on top of the scope. And then there's also this second dedicated piece, and I think you touched on this in your prior episode, that's fitted over that transducer, and that's called the UDK. Right. And that is a separate piece that allows you to perform FNA or FMB. And, it was definitely a little bit clunky. My first cases, the way they were using it, the way they were setting it up was kind of spiraled around the scope. So it was a little challenging to kind of hold everything and be able to push. But the thing I noticed right away was that I was looking at beautiful images of the liver and the pancreas from the vantage point of the stomach. And my thought right away was, I think I could fix the rest of this because the imaging is great. Because for me, that was my fixed point. If the imaging was no good, it didn't matter about everything else.
Right.
But because there was a great image, I was just so impressed. I was like, I can figure the rest out.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, I think for a first generation device, number one, the picture's amazing for first generation. Is it as good as an Arietta? No, I mean, let's call it what it is. But is it as good as an EUME1 or EUME2? Yeah, I think so. I feel like it's the same thing. There's definitely.
I'd actually go one step further. I would actually say it's for me, because I've used the EMU2.
Okay.
I've used an F75. That's my backup at the hospital. Right. And I use a Arietta, and I would say it's on par with the F75. And I say this because I had a day where the Arietta was broken, and I had to use the F75 for all my cases. And I was like, why am I here? I should have done all these at the ASC. I don't even have an Arietta today.
No, that's good to know. I mean, I've only done personally about 15 cases with the Endosound so far. I'm just, I have a different reason for doing it. It's more of a business case with the ASC company we work with that I'm trying to see if it's something that we can put in other ASCs. As you mentioned, we have a traditional setup, and, just for background, we started with a Pros Alpha 10, I think is what we started with. And that was back in 2012. We got it refurbished from Olympus, and we used that. There were two of us. We were each doing between 250 to 500 in the ASC a year. The first year, I think we were over 1,000, second year, third year. Then we actually started interventional fellowship, and the ASC became a training site. So we were able to keep that traditional system for many years. But then we had to go to we ended up going to the Endosound just to trial it, because our Olympus machine failed, and we had to end up buying a new one. So we were going to do Endosound because we were slowing down on the fellowship, but the problem was they weren't FDA approved when we first started talking to them. And we were in a dire strait where we didn't have a machine. Our machine was on its last leg. So we ended up going with the Fuji system, which is the desktop version, or the cart top version, if you will. And I think those pictures are pretty equivalent to the Endosound. So I was pretty impressed by it. Definitely a learning curve. The way I describe it to people is that if you're used to turning your body 180 degrees to the right, or maybe 90 degrees to the right to do something, you might have to turn it a little bit differently with the Endosound versus a traditional system, just because the transducer doesn't sit exactly in the same area that you're used to it. And so it's a learning curve in getting your body movements. And so my first 5 cases were great. My next 5 cases were not so great. And then the following 5 cases were much better. So it's kind of like this cyclical, or this sine wave, if you will.
Yeah. And did you, just out of curiosity, did you use just the UTM with bands, or did you use the whole thing with the UDK attached?
I haven't used the UDK yet. We have Olympus scopes, and so they're still waiting for some kind of approval for the attachment for it. So I'm just doing the quote unquote diagnostic with the bands. That's it, right? So.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, that was one of the many things that impressed me with the company, because I basically sat down with them. I mean, literally Josh, and Patrick Hurley went to have coffee sort of as a debrief after I did my first round of cases. And I said, a lot of this is a little bit clunky because of all the things that I'm kind of holding. I said, if I'm not going to do FNA, if I know I'm just doing a diagnostic case for a dilated bile duct or a pancreatic cancer screening, why do I need all of this? Like, why do I need to have the ability? Why don't I just strip it down and use it directly? And they kind of were like, I don't see why you couldn't. I mean, it's approved as it is.
Right.
So that's where we went right ahead and we switched. And I mean, to your point, I mean, the learning curve just like exponentially shifted the next day I did it, because I was like, whoa, this is way easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, we'll talk a little bit about the financial considerations about EUS and the ASC in a sec, but, the biggest takeaway that I had was that I can do something that offers value to myself personally, to my patients, and ultimately to the ASC, and fits right into my block schedule without, hurting any of the dynamics that are currently in place.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the way to approach it. And that's kind of been like the soapbox that I've tried to stand on a little bit over the last few years with people. But, it's hard to convince, like in your situation, you're one guy going to your partners and your ASC partners and saying, hey, I want to bring this procedure here. Well, what's it going to cost? Well, it's going to be $500,000 to get this, big ultrasound machine, which looks, by the way, is the exact same ultrasound machine that they're using for other things, but you have to buy the software because, money. And we've got to buy 3 scopes and $500,000 and do all this stuff. And yeah, by the way, the ROI is around 400 to 500 cases, of which I'm probably only going to give you 100 a year. So it's going to take 5 years for you guys to make your money. Maybe more than 100, but like a city like the Dallas area, where you probably have 25 to 50 interventionalists lying around in that city. When we started doing it, there was only maybe 10 people in the Phoenix area doing EUS, and now there's about 50 or 60. And as a result, not at 50, 60, sorry, 30 or 40, but as a result, our volume has dropped, right? So it's harder now today to make the case, let's go spend $500,000 by the best of the best when we're only going to be doing 150 to 300 cases a year. So, it's you need a much cheaper option for that. So.
Right. And that's kind of where the discussion begins, right? So I think, not talking about Endosound in particular, but when you think about bringing any kind of new technology into the ASC, right, you have to think about what the capital expenditure is going to be. Like, what's it going to cost you to get it in the ASC? What's the true volume? Like, how much are you really going to use it? What's the reimbursement, right? At the end of the day, you want to help patients, but it's a business.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to know, if I'm spending X and I'm only returning Y, does that make sense?
Yep.
And then ultimately, what's the availability? Like, how does that translate to all the people that are doing cases in the ASC? Is that something that primarily helps only one person? Is it something that helps multiple people?
Right.
And, for Endosound, the argument, or I should say, before getting to Endosound, the argument was exactly what you had said, right? So your options are, I can buy the best. I can buy an Arietta, which currently sits at, I think, like $400,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
Or I can get a refurbished unit of the prior generation, which I think is what most people end up doing, because significant cost savings. And then you also have to buy new scopes, right? And I'll say something that I realized a couple of weeks ago, which I didn't mentally pick up on until recently. I've done about 100 cases almost with the Endosound probes, and I have 2 probes. So I'm using, let's say, 50 in one and 50 in the other, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had one fracture yet.
Right.
Right. This is something that's so durable that I have no idea what happens once it leaves my room. Right.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it may not necessarily be handled with the utmost of care that I expect, but hopefully it is.
Yeah.
And it hasn't fractured yet. Whereas I have these, I won't say which brand, but I have these scopes that I use regularly at the hospital, and we're constantly rotating them out to go get them sent to get fixed. They're just very, very, very fragile. The crystals are breaking constantly.
Oh, yeah.
And that, again, is like another point to think about, because if you're an ASC, you have to think about what are the costs, not just capitally, but of maintenance, right? 100%. And what happens when you don't have that, and how do you get replacements? So, sort of enter Endosound. They take care of the capital expenditure because their system is offered at a fraction of the cost of the traditional ultrasound system. And to your point, it's the same ultrasound that you're using for everything else, but you have to get the one for EUS, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Just to add to your point on the repair thing, the other thing that, to repair an EUS scope versus a regular scope, different costs completely. And then also, if you sign a contract with some of the big scope repair companies, most of those are tied up with device industry. And so, if you go to company X and say, hey, I want to get my scope serviced by you, well, that's great, but we have accessory company A that we work with. So you're going to be in a contract with them to use their forceps, needle, snares, etc. Right. So that may, affect some of your partners. Maybe somebody loves using company A's biopsy forceps, but they have to use company B's biopsy forceps now, and they're not happy with that. Now, obviously biopsy forceps is a crappy example, but the point is, you get tied into maybe something that not everybody wants to use, and so not only do you have to pay more for those scopes to be repaired, you also now have to potentially use accessories you don't necessarily love, so it's kind of a double-edged sword in that regard.
Right. And, with this kind of setup, personally, I always wanted to try to figure out how to get EUS into the ASC, because I knew it would help my practice.
Right.
And it would help me, because as much as I love the hospital I work with, they really are a great partner. I mean, they get us the best stuff. They really have excellent patient care. It's still a hospital. So the costs to the patient are higher. The turnaround is slower. Again, not necessarily their fault. They deal with more higher acuity patients, and therefore the patients just take longer because they're sicker. So even if I'm showing up as an outpatient doctor that day, I'm working within the confines of everything else that's going on in that endo suite.
Yeah.
So I knew that if I could try and get some of these cases, and I'd love to hear if this is true because you've been doing this longer than me, but I would imagine the more cases you do at the ASC, not just from a personal profitability standpoint of being able to, get your numbers up and produce within the ASC, but I've actually found personally, I can consolidate my hospital time so that I'm spending more time in a much more controlled environment that I can positively affect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, time saving is amazing when you're doing these things in the ASC. I think, and even a simple upper endoscopy at most hospitals takes 45 minutes, including turnover time and everything like that. And so when you're talking about EUS, sometimes you can get a really simple EUS knocked out in 15 to 30 minutes, if you're looking for a very specific thing. And that's still going to take an hour, including turnover time. Where in an ASC, your turnover time, in a well-run center is between 5 to 10 minutes max, And so you can literally do these on 30 or 45-minute blocks at an ASC versus hour to hour and 15-minute blocks at a hospital. So time saving is amazing. It lets you focus when you are in the hospital doing cases that take longer. That you're going to be there, and you get your patients better. And ultimately, it's cheaper for the patient too to be at the ASC than the hospital. So,
yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, if you just literally look up the CMS reimbursement for a Medicare patient, they pay half the price for the same procedure if they do it at the ASC as opposed to going to the hospital. And, nowadays, that's a very real consideration when you're talking about how to schedule a patient.
Well, it's actually, it's the CMS reimbursement's double, but remember, and as you know, ASC, everything's bundled within that $812 fee for EUS. The hospital's $1,500 to $1,600, but they can charge for nursing time, IVs, medications. Everything's can be tacked on to that. So the EOB, or explanation of benefits for or the bill that a patient gets, may be listed at $5,000 to $10,000 depending on what they're doing for an EUS versus ASC. It's pretty black and white. This is what it is. The bill may say $2,000, but all that's being paid to the ASC is $812 if it's a Medicare patient. So
right.
So it's a lot cheaper ultimately. So.
Yeah, and along those lines, that was kind of the pitch when I went to the board and I went to my partners about why it makes sense for us to try to do this, right? Because of course, the initial feedback was, well, only one person is going to benefit, only one person is going to be using it. How does that make sense for all of us? And again, no one was coming with any kind of, negative thoughts about it.
Yeah.
It was just practical, right? Like, are these going to be higher risk patients? Is it going to take longer? Is it going to mess with the block schedule? And these are all valid concerns. And, we looked up and realized right away, so reimbursement for endoscopic ultrasound comes back at the highest reimbursement on the EGD table. So we use what are called CPT codes in order to appropriately code and request payment for procedures. They're typically put into categories, and in the ASC, we're usually using the category for upper endoscopy and the category for colonoscopy. And endoscopic ultrasound pays at that higher end of the table for upper endoscopy. So, pitch number one was, well, I'm going to bring a procedure that every time I do it pays us the equivalent of the best payment we can get for an upper endoscopy. So I'm going to utilize that slot at its highest potential. So that was, sort of argument number one for why it made sense for me to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Argument number two for why it made sense for everyone else. Well, aside from the fact that everything that I contribute as an individual gets shared by everybody because we're all partners,
right?
There's a piece of it that benefits everybody. Well, now when you guys see something funny on your endoscopy, you literally could say to your patient, when they wake up, hey, I found this bump in your stomach. I don't think it's really all that concerning, but you don't even have to worry about it. My partner, Dr. Akerman, is going to schedule you and bring you back, and he's going to take a look at it under ultrasound, and we'll figure out what's going on.
Exactly. And that's, especially when you have a big practice backing you up, that's a huge advantage, right? Because then you have internal referrals for the lumps and bumps, as we call them. And, obviously, you can start looking at expanded indications for EUS, gallbladder polyps, random abdominal pain, right upper quadrant pain, all those things that, now you're seeing that patient in the office, we're going to do an EGD anyway, right? And we're going to then send you for an abdominal ultrasound, and then we might send you for a CT. You could actually consolidate some of those into one visit. We'll do an EGD and an endoscopic ultrasound. We'll see if you have a gallbladder or bile duct stone, or if you have something, sludge in your gallbladder. We'll see if you've got something else going on. Do you have a, pancreas issue, whatnot? So you can now consolidate. Instead of sending that patient for two separate tests, you can do it in one test. It's a little bit more cost effective for the insurance system and for the patient. But so what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced so far getting the ultrasound into your ASC and getting buy-in, outside of making the business case? I think that would probably be the biggest kind of rate limiting step for a lot of practices. But now that you've done that, and you've kind of convinced them, what are the challenges you faced once you wanted to start the program?
Interesting question. So I think the biggest challenges are probably figuring out the right indications. So, I'm currently using it for diagnostic purposes only, right? Mm-hmm. And when I first started, there was that sort of, little Dr. Akerman sitting on my shoulder saying, you got to be really sure you're scheduling the patient in the right place, because what if it turns out there's some need for, advanced imaging or FNA, and I'm not going to be able to do it. Now I got to bring that patient to the hospital. And it's always good to have that sort of conscious check so that you're doing the right thing for the patient. And what I quickly realized is it's no different than how we sort of mentally screen our patients in general, right? A great example would be a cirrhotic patient with a varicose screen. Are you going to choose to do every single endoscopy for varicose screening at the hospital when you realize that at the end of the day, you only end up banding 2% of all the patients? And I think the answer for most people is no, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for your own schedule. It doesn't make sense for the cost of the patient. So you'll end up bringing 100% of those patients to the ASC, knowing that every once in a while you're going to tell someone, hey, I'm going to rebook this in a safer, higher acuity area at the hospital and do a banding.
Right.
Once I realized that, it really transformed how I started scheduling the patients, because I realized, if someone has a 2.5 centimeter pancreatic cyst and there's a great chance that I want to FNA that, maybe I should just bring that to the hospital and get that taken care of in one shot. But if someone is basically asking me about a 1.2 centimeter cyst because they want to know if it's more likely an IPMN and it communicates and what the surrounding architecture looks like, I can do that in 10, 15 minutes at the ASC and everyone wins. And that patient is thrilled that they were able to do it in a super efficient manner. So once I started doing that, it really transformed everything, because that was really my biggest hurdle. I mean, there's, I would say not hurdles, but thoughts towards the future, right? Because I'm not happy now. I love what I'm doing, and I love how it's changed my practice in just 9 months.
Right.
I want more.
Right.
I want to know what the next step is. What's the next about? How do I get more patients, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say those are hurdles. Those are just like my roadmap for how to expand this even further, because I'll actually give you numbers to that, right? So I looked up my caseload and sort of how it shifted and what happened. So in the 8.5 month period from when I started doing it, so I looked at this 8.5 month period, but I looked at the year prior when I was only at the hospital.
Right.
And I did 112 EUS cases at the hospital. And then this year, in the same time frame, so sort of apples to apples, accommodating variance in quarter and things like that, I did 92 cases, I believe, or 96 cases at the hospital and 88 cases in the ASC.
Right.
So it made my life better.
Yeah.
It also grew my practice.
Yep.
I had a 64% increase in EUS over the same time frame, year over year.
Yep. No, that's absolutely. Because, You also you have more availability in the ASC, so if you're doing all of these in the hospital, we already talked about the time constraints and everything like that, but then, you may only be able to book 5 to 7 cases in a hospital in one day, where you theoretically could book 15 to 18 in an ASC if you wanted to. Not that anybody would do that many US and ASC in a day, but you could. I mean, the structure is there for that. But the hospital's not. The hospital is always going to be 5 to 7 max, and then you have to deal with staff has to go at 5 and overtime and all those things. So you've got that. So you have more availability to do more. In addition to, you now have, okay, there's this site, your lower acuity, I'm going to send you over here. Your higher acuity, I'm going to send you over there. And to your point about the sending them to the hospital versus the endo center, if you're doing them open access, perfect, right? And if you're seeing them in the office beforehand, you already kind of know on a pancreatic cyst case which ones you're going to FNA anyway, right? When you're seeing them in consultation, you've got their imaging, you've got the reports. You're like, all right, this one, 80% chance going to FNA it, so I'll just send this one to the hospital. If you're not doing FNA in your endo center, which is a whole, and that might be a challenge that some practices that are starting off with EUS will have. How do you do that? How do you justify the cost of a needle, et cetera, et cetera? But, if you figure that part out, it's a different story. But, if you know that you're not wanting to do FNA, FNB in your endo center for whatever reasons, and you already kind of know who you're going to do that to, so you send them to the hospital in the first place. But if you don't have an idea that we're just checking things out, I don't think I would FNA this, I don't think you need an FNB right off the bat, then I'll send you to the ASC. I mean, that's a great way to start. And then as your practice matures and you start getting to a crucial number, you can start exploring putting needles into the endo center as well. So, yeah, I think you have to look at the cost per case, and like you guys work with AmSurge, so AmSurge would tell you that our cost per case is X, and we know that the Medicare reimbursement for EUS FNA or non-FNA is, like I said earlier, $812 or whatever it is. And so if the cost per case is $600, which is not, but if it is $600, then you're not going to put a $250 needle in the ASC. If the cost per case is $200 and they're making $812, yeah, you could justify a $250 needle. So that's kind of how it's just math at that point, and that'll justify whether or not they'll allow you to do it or not. So, because ultimately, when you have a partner like an AmSurge or USPI that owns or runs the center, they usually own 51%. So the buck stops with them, so to speak, that we are not spending this on this device because we will lose money. I mean, ultimately, they're running a business, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to sort of make a throwback to a comment you made earlier about, interventional endoscopists and engagement in the ASC.
Yeah.
And, this is an equalizer, right? Mm-hmm. Because to your point, you could do more cases at an ASC than you can in a hospital on any given day, because turnaround eats up time, or even sort of minute to minute, even if you did the same amount of scoping time, other factors eat up a lot of that day. And when you have an interventional endoscopist that you just freed from the hospital for that day and instead can come to your ASC, they're going to do 5 or 6 EUSs, but then they're also going to do 5 or 6 endoscopies and 5 or 6 colonoscopies. And now they just filled out an entire room for the day. So they just brought, 16 to 18 cases of their own. They just helped you with your ASC utilization. And if you compound that over how many people do you have doing it and how many days a month extra did you just get, you just made a use case for maybe an ASC that's not functioning optimally. Maybe they have a room that sits empty most of the time and they're not utilizing it appropriately, and they're spending FTEs on staffing for a room that's not getting enough use. And you just filled that room. You just made it so that you, number one, enabled the ASC to become more efficient. And number two, you help someone get their stats.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is 100% the business case for any interventionalist to look into this who's in the private world, for sure. It's not necessarily only EUS, right? I mean, just to digress a little bit, endoscopic mucosal resections, are you going to do an 8-centimeter EMR or ESD in an ASC today in 2024? Probably not, and no. Could you do a 2-centimeter polyp or a 3-centimeter polyp in an ASC as an EMR? Yes. But then people say, well, what about the use of clips? And what about the use of lifting agents and things like that? most people, even people in private practice, don't realize that the reimbursement for an EMR is double that of a polypectomy. So when people come to me and say, well, you used a clip on that case or 2 clips on that case, I said, well, what did that clip cost? And they'll say, well, it was $110 or $150, whatever it was. Okay, so we spent $300 extra. Yeah. Okay, and then we used lifting agent was $50. So we spent $400 extra on this case. And so you can't do this anymore because we only get paid $650 for Medicare for polypectomy. So, well, you don't know your data. Look at the EMR code. And they go in there and it's $1,300. And it's like, you just made more money by investing $400 in this case than you would have if, we just did it. You just made a lot more money and it took the same amount of time. Again, this isn't, number one, not every polypectomy should be an EMR. So if anyone's listening, that's not what I'm advocating. And number two, it should be within reason. I'm not saying go do like I said, a 5 to 8 centimeter polyp in the cecum as an EMR and an ASC. I'm not saying that whatsoever. But there are cases that you see like a 2.5 centimeter polyp and it needs an EMR. You're like, okay, we're done. We're going to take this guy to the hospital in a couple of weeks and do it. It's a different scenario. So I think EUS kind of falls in those things. These are things that the interventionalists can bring into from their practice to the ASC and be successful in it.
Yeah, apropos of this conversation, I literally had that happen yesterday. A patient with multiple polyps, and one of them was a 2.5 centimeter polyp that went over the fold.
Yep.
And in years past, I would have said, you know what, I'm not going to sit here and use saline, and it's not quite working well, and we're just to say forget it. I'm going to biopsy the edge and do it again in the hospital. I just had a lifting agent. We went, we did it, we took it out, done. Patient's finished. Patient's going to come back at their appropriate interval when we figure it out based on the path. Yeah. And safe and easy. Lifting agents completely change the game. And I agree with you. I think completely worth the cost because you know what? We spent more time, but it was recognized by the insurance because we were able to change that code.
Right.
Because you know what? You did something that was a little higher risk. You did something that needed more expertise. We want to acknowledge that and we want to pay for that.
Right.
And that's, I think, the key to all of this.
Yeah. It's also, 100% and making sure that you're using it appropriately. I mean, if everybody starts, and unfortunately, there are people out there who are unscrupulous. They're going to turn every polypectomy into EMR when they catch on to this. But yeah, then the insurance are going to have to start auditing. But there's certain things that you have to prove. You have to mark it with NBI or, some people use chromo endoscopy, but you can use NBI and it's got to be a certain size, certain characteristic, before you start lifting everything. So yeah, I guess that's kind of one of the future directions outside of that. Have you guys experienced any, or have you heard from AmSurg, have you experienced any difficulty in getting reimbursed for the EUSs that you have done, the 110 cases that you've done in the ASC so far? Have you had any issues with that? And also to that, have you started working on using the pass-through code that was recently approved?
So to answer the first question, we haven't had any issues getting reimbursement. We do check to see if pre-certification is required before. So when we schedule the patient, just like we do with any procedure, we'll make sure that if pre-cert is necessary, we'll take care of it. So I think because of that vigilance, we really haven't had an issue. Mm-hmm. As far as the TPT code, so it's still new. It only got approved as of July. So we have a whole bunch of kind of balls in the hopper, so to speak. I don't think I actually followed up on this last week. We've seen some of the private payers starting to come back and paying for it to various degrees. We're actually still waiting on our first Medicare reimbursement. So they're all sort of still out there pending. So I can't really comment on it yet, but they have been submitted. So every case that I've done since the TPT was approved by CMS has been submitted appropriately along with the EUS. So now it's just a little bit of a waiting game to see how the response is.
Yeah, and so they haven't been approved, but they haven't been declined either yet at this point.
Oh, correct. Yeah, so we haven't seen any kind of documentation that says, "Oh no, we're not paying for this."
Well, I wouldn't be fair because Medicare takes anywhere between 60 to 90 days to pay for some of these things anyway, so that's within the window. So more to come on that, I guess. But that is, obviously, when we going back to an earlier point about cost per case, when you buy a fixed system or a reusable system, that cost of that system, whatever it is, $400,000, $500,000, gets kind of aggregated over per case, right? I mean, that's how you would do it as a business person. You would look like, we did 100 EUS and we paid X for the machine, and this is what it costs per case. And if we were able to do 500, it would be cheaper. This is a cost per case as well with Endosound, but if you're getting the pass-through code, you could basically be doing this case with no cost to the center in terms of the probes and everything like that, and they're getting reimbursed for it. So essentially, it's pure profit to the center. There's no cost per case for equipment is what I'm getting at, if the code goes through. And that's, I think, something that a lot of people are going to be interested to hear about in the future, because that's going to make the case whether they can use it or not. So, okay. So what do you see? So what would you tell? I mean, we talked a little bit at various points in the conversation, but for the young interventionalists who are currently training or coming out into the marketplace right now, what are some of the things that you'll tell them to look at, if specifically with Endosound, if they want to use it in their practices? Like, what are the things that they should be aware of? What are some of the things that they should ask? And what are some of the things that they should expect?
So I would say it's true for not just young physicians, but any adopter, right? It's all about kind of expectation. Like, what is it that you're trying to accomplish by introducing it in the practice, right? So if you're looking to be able to carve out some patients that you can do more efficiently, you're looking to expand your practice, I think that's a great use case scenario today. You could bring it today, and you can start doing that today. There are some things you have to understand, and you alluded to this. The transducer is set up in a slightly different way than a traditional transducer. So I think you do have to have some comfort with EUS. Maybe it makes sense more for somebody who has a couple years under their belt. They understand how to make the fine-tune changes to obtain the images when the anatomy doesn't work out perfectly. I think those people are going to sort of jump in with both feet and be very comfortable very quickly, whereas someone who, hasn't done enough cases yet to really understand when the abnormal changes how the normal is shown, those people might have a little more challenge. I'll tell you one place where I find it's actually easier is in the second portion of the duodenum, because the way the traditional setup is, you have your ampulla kind of set up, in most cases, like around 10 o'clock.
Right.
But your transducer is actually looking the opposite way from your ampulla. So you have to manipulate the scope with torque to pull back and get the uncinate, the front part of the pancreas, and the ampulla into view, which could sometimes be the most challenging part of the case.
Right.
But here, because the transducer is actually 180 degrees, it's placed against and opposite from where you're looking, you're actually staring directly at the ampulla.
Yeah.
So in most cases, when I get into the second portion and I turn on the ultrasound, I'm actually already staring at the uncinate and potentially even the ampulla, or just making a slight move. And now I have a beautiful ampullary view with both ducts kind of going right in.
Yeah.
Similar to that, the one place where it's actually different is in the duodenal bulb. And you have to understand that where you put the transducer along your scope changes where you're seeing the head of the pancreas compared to the duodenal fall off. Yeah. But if you have it set up around 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock rather, excuse me, then you're actually seeing the head of the pancreas as it comes across. So in many cases, people who have kind of a traditional C loop anatomy rather than a little bit of an S loop anatomy, when you find the bile duct across from the portal vein, you can literally follow it going all the way across the head of the pancreas right into the ampulla.
Right.
It gives you a really great view, especially when you're looking for that stone or something that's going on with the bile duct. So, like any other new technology, there's advantages and disadvantages, but I think the most important part of it is understanding your tool and understanding the differences. And I think that's where you can really kind of change that learning curve completely.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we got a really, really good overview of it, and I think we'll probably end things here. But I first of all want to thank you for this. I know we're going to be coming back to do part two, talking about artificial intelligence and everything like that. So stay tuned for that if you're listening and watching. But I think in conclusion, I think we both kind of just made a really good case for people to explore EUS. If you're not, I think the problem that I've seen in a lot of physician groups is that people are very set in their ways. We've never done it this way. It's always should be done in these locations. But we have to, as an interventional community, really have to start challenging those old adages so that we can really grow our practice. There's so many people graduating each year who are well trained in these procedures. And frankly speaking, there's not that many academic jobs compared to the number of people who are graduating. And most people who are graduating for interventional fellowship will be in setups where they are not 100% interventional. Those jobs do exist, but they're not as common as some of us would like. So you are probably going to be in a situation where you're doing between 50 to 70% interventional and the remainder general. So if that's your story, this is a really great way to move the needle towards more interventional as opposed to less interventional. So, but thank you so much for your time. And we'll end it here, and then we'll kind of go into the other one soon.
Please hit that like button